Okay, here we go again. We're ready for chapter 3. And we're worried about our friend Susan. Susan, of course, is upset about her teacher, Miss Schwartz, who is missing. And the new sub is not so fun, Mr. Smith. He does not like fun. He does not like good books like The Hobbit. And he does not like music. And so this made Susan upset, and she has written an angry note, not very nice note, shouldn't do it, about Mr. Smith. Tried to pass it to her friend Stacy in class, and instead it wound up in the tests that Mr. Smith has collected. So we are going to find out today, did Mr. Smith get that note, and is Susan in a whole lot of trouble? Let's find out together. Here we go. An Unearthly Noise, Chapter 3. The only thing I could think about for the rest of the day was how I was going to get that note back. When we went outside for recess, I pulled Stacy aside to tell her what had happened. "What am I going to do?" I wailed. "I don't know," she said, "but you'd better do something, because if that note has my name on it, Mr. Smith will get mad at me, too." "Well, maybe he won't see it," I said. Stacy snorted. "Are you kidding? He's checked every single paper we ever handed in." Stacy was right. She always was when it came to that kind of stuff. Actually, the heavy-duty checking was probably the best thing about Mr. Smith. He always handed back our papers. Of course, they never had a note or comment on them, just lots of red circles around the mistakes and a grade at the top. I didn't mind that on math papers, but it really annoyed me when it came to my writing. When Ms. Schwartz marked our stories and essays, she had always penciled in comments that showed she was paying attention to our ideas. When Mr. Smith handed back an essay, it looked as though he'd just been sitting next to an axe murderer while he was marking it up. The man must have bought red pens by the case, but all he used them for was to circle missing commas and misspelled words. He treated our essays like spelling tests. I ask you, what's the point of writing something if that's the only response you get? Finally, I decided to try to get back into the building to see if I could snatch my note while Mr. Smith was still outside. If it had been Ms. Schwartz, I would have just asked if I could go to the bathroom. But Mr. Smith didn't believe in letting you off the playground for such a frivolous reason. He said by the time you were in 6th grade, you should know enough to take care of things like that in advance. The first 3 days after Mr. Smith came, we had a line of worried-looking kids standing at the door each time recess ended. The second best method for getting off the playground was getting sick. "I'll see you inside," I said to Stacy. Then I clutched my stomach and squinched up my face and staggered over to where Mr. Smith was standing. Later, I remembered that he was looking straight at the sun, but right then I was too worried about the note to pay attention to the fact that what he was doing should have burned out his eyeballs. "Oh," I moaned, trying to sound pitiful. Mr. Smith looked down at me. "Is something wrong, Miss Simmons?" he asked. "I don't feel good," I said. "I want to see the nurse." Mr. Smith hesitated and then looked up at his watch. "It's time to go in now. Anyway," he said, "line up with the rest of us. You can see Miss Glacka after we get in." Well, now what? If I claimed I was about to throw up, he'd probably let me go inside right away. But if he was bringing everyone else in anyway, I wouldn't have the time I needed to go through the papers and find the note. "All right," I moaned, trying to sound pitiful. I hoped it would make him feel guilty. I almost wished I was going to throw up. I'd make sure to hit his shoes. Of course, once we were inside, I had to go to the nurse's office, even though I actually felt perfectly fine. Mrs. Glacka told me to lie down. I wasn't surprised. That was her basic cure for everything. So I lay there staring at the ceiling and worrying about that note. Finally, I decided to follow Mr. Smith home. Maybe I could find some way to get the note back before it was too late. I didn't have any big plan, mind you. I was just desperate. I wasn't sure where Mr. Smith lived, but I figured it couldn't be too far since he always walked to school. So after the last bell, I hung around in the playground, waiting for Mr. Smith to come out of the building. I was concentrating so hard I almost jumped out of my skin when Peter Thompson came up behind me and said, "Hey, Susan, what are you doing?" "None of your business," I hissed. "Leave me alone." Peter's skinny face kind of crumpled, and he looked like he was going to cry. Look," I said, "this is private, okay?" "Sure," said Peter. "I won't bother you." He tucked his book under his arm and walked away, trying to whistle. It was a pretty pathetic sound. I thought about Peter and realized with a shock that I was probably the closest thing he had to a friend. That made me kind of sad. Not that there's anything wrong with having me for a friend, but I've got lots of friends, and I didn't think and I didn't really think of Peter as being one of them. I liked him all right, he just wasn't someone I spent much time with. I wondered if there was anyone who did spend time with him. My thoughts were interrupted when I saw Mr. Smith come out of the building. I waited for a minute or two, then began sneaking along behind him. I tried to stay a half a block or so away. Whenever I could, I ducked behind a tree or a bush so he wouldn't spot me. I probably looked pretty weird, but that's one nice thing about being a kid. You can get away with this kind of stuff. Mr. Smith's home was farther away than I had expected. He lived at the edge of town in an old white house with black shutters. The house was set way back from the street. A thick hedge completely surrounded the lot on which it stood. I stood outside the hedge, feeling stupid. What had I hoped to accomplish by following Mr. Smith? But I was in luck. As I watched from a hole in the hedge, I saw Mr. Smith set his briefcase down on the porch and go inside. Since it was a warm afternoon, I figured he planned to get something to drink, and then came back outside to sit on the porch and correct our papers. This was my chance. I scooted through a hole in the hedge and onto the porch. I was working up the nerve to open the briefcase when I heard an unearthly howl. It sounded like someone was trying to put a cat in a blender. Hot as it was, I felt my blood turn to ice. What was going on in there? Had someone attacked Mr. Smith? I wasn't crazy about the man, but I didn't want him to be tortured or anything, which is what this sounded like. Should I run for help? Or go inside? But what kind of help could I get? All I could say was that I had heard a terrible noise. Nobody was yelling for help or anything like that. I didn't think I could get anyone to come. Then it occurred to me that maybe Mr. Smith really was putting a cat in a blender or something awful like that. If so, he certainly shouldn't be teaching our class. I decided to find out.